180 explosions in a single year, an ash cloud rising more than 30,000 feet into the sky, a wall of burning ash, gas, and rock, tearing down the side of a mountain faster than anyone could run, 7 square miles of forest wiped out. And somehow, during the biggest eruption, not one person was killed. That sounds like a success story. Like officials saw the danger, cleared the area, and saved everyone before things went bad. But that is not what happened. There was no major evacuation, no modern warning system, no emergency agency watching the mountain around the clock. Scientists recorded the signs, but most people living nearby were never given a clear reason to leave. They stayed on their farms. Travelers kept using the trails. Photographers moved closer to the mountain. Families still treated Lassen Peak like a quiet place to visit. Then, on the afternoon of the 22nd of May, 1915, the mountain finally exploded. The eruption was violent enough to flatten old trees, throw hot rock across the landscape, and send ash hundreds of miles away. Anyone caught in the path of the pyroclastic flow would have had almost no chance. But the path was empty. Not because someone had planned it that way. People were simply somewhere else. One photographer packed up early because he was tired. A teacher canceled a hike because the weather was too cold. A rancher had moved his cattle. A road was closed for reasons that had nothing to do with the volcano. Small decisions, lucky timing, no connection between them. Together, they helped create a miracle that most people never realized was a miracle. So, was Lassen really a successful emergency response? Or was it a disaster that happened to strike an empty room? In this video, we are going to look at the warnings Lassen gave, why those warnings failed to create real action, and how ordinary people came within minutes of being caught in one of California's most violent volcanic events. Because the lesson from 1915 is not that Lassen was harmless. The lesson is that luck worked once. And next time, it may not. Before we talk about the eruption itself, there's one person you need to know about. His name was Benjamin Franklin Loomis. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a government official. He was a lumberman who lived near Lassen Peak. But he also had a passion for photography. And that passion would end up preserving one of the most important records of an American volcano. For almost a year, Loomis kept coming back to the mountain. Every time something changed, he was there. He watched new craters form. He photographed clouds of steam rising from the summit. He documented the growing lava dome, one glass plate at a time. Long before most people realized something serious was happening, Loomis was quietly building a visual timeline of the volcano's awakening. By the morning of the 22nd of May, 1915, he had already created the most complete photographic record anyone had ever made of an active volcano in the continental United States. That morning, he headed back out again. He photographed the muddy path left behind by the recent lahar. He captured rows of shattered trees lying across the landscape. Then he stopped to photograph a massive boulder that had been blasted out of the crater just a few days earlier. People later called it the hot rock. It had been sitting there for 3 days. It was still too hot to touch. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Loomis looked around, packed up his camera, folded his tripod, and started heading home. Not because someone warned him, not because he thought the mountain was about to explode. He was simply tired. It had been a long day, and the light wasn't getting any better. So, he called it quits. About an hour later, everything changed. The exact place where he had been standing that afternoon disappeared beneath a fast-moving pyroclastic flow. Trees were flattened. The ground was buried under scorching ash. Nothing standing there had any chance of surviving. If Loomis had stayed just a little longer, there's a good chance we wouldn't know his name today. The photographs that filled history books might never have existed. What saved him wasn't experience. It wasn't perfect judgment, and it definitely wasn't an official warning. It was one ordinary decision made at exactly the right moment. That's what makes this story so powerful. It's easy to look at someone who survived and assume the area must have been safe. But that's not always true. Sometimes the danger is already there. The only difference is that one person leaves just before it arrives. The story didn't begin with one giant explosion. It started almost a full year earlier. On the 30th of May 1914, a hiker named Harvey Abbey was climbing near the summit of Lassen Peak. At the time, nobody thought much about the mountain. Every guidebook called it extinct. People came there to fish, hunt, camp, and enjoy the scenery. It wasn't a place anyone worried about. Then everything changed. Abbey heard a deep roar. A second later, a huge column of steam blasted more than 1,000 feet into the air. Ash started falling onto his shoulders, and he did the only thing that made sense. He ran. That was warning number one. Most people would remember it as a strange event, but it wasn't just a random explosion. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Over the next 12 months, Lassen produced another 179 steam explosions. Some were small. They lasted less than a minute and didn't seem like a big deal. Others were impossible to ignore. They shook windows nearly 20 miles away. They darkened the sky in the middle of the day. Each new blast slowly changed the mountain itself. The summit crater kept getting bigger. Snow around the vent started melting, even in cold weather. Deep underground, heat was building. By the spring of 1915, a thick lava dome had begun pushing its way up inside the crater. The pressure was growing, even if most people couldn't see it. Here's what makes this story so frustrating. Scientists knew the volcano was changing. They documented every explosion. They measured the crater. They recorded the new lava dome. The evidence was right there. But if you were an ordinary visitor reading a travel guide, you'd see something completely different. Those books still described Lassen as a peaceful mountain, a beautiful place to hike, a volcano that belonged to the past. So there were really two different stories being told at the same time. One came from scientists watching an active volcano wake up. The other came from outdated information that told people everything was fine. Most people believed the second story, and honestly, it's hard to blame them. When you've been told for years that a place is safe, it's not easy to suddenly believe it's dangerous. That's why outdated information can be so dangerous. The threat may be changing right in front of you, but if the message never changes, most people won't either. By this point, the warning signs weren't a mystery anymore. Scientists had been watching Lassen for months. One of the leading geologists was Joseph Silas Diller from the U.S. Geological Survey. He and his team carefully tracked every steam explosion. They measured the growing crater. They studied the new lava dome. They wrote everything down and published their findings. The science was solid. The problem wasn't a lack of information. The problem was that the information never reached the people who needed it most. Back in 1915, there was no public volcano warning system, no emergency management agency, no civil defense office. No one had the authority to close roads, clear valleys, or tell entire communities to evacuate. The reports moved through universities, government offices, and scientific journals, and that's where they stopped. If you were a rancher living near Lassen, you probably knew the mountain was smoking. You might have read a few newspaper stories. You could see steam rising from the summit with your own eyes. But that's very different from knowing your life is in danger. Nobody told these families, "You need to leave today." Nobody drew a danger zone on a map. Nobody explained how quickly the situation could change. So people did what most of us would probably do. They stayed. They kept working. They moved their cattle a little farther away. They paid attention, but they also tried to live their lives. And honestly, it's easy for us to judge them from more than 100 years later. We know what happened next. They didn't. Walking away from a ranch wasn't a simple decision. Your land wasn't just where you lived. It was your job, your savings, and your family's future. Leaving meant risking everything you owned because of something that might happen. That's a hard choice for anyone. Looking back, it wasn't that people ignored the warning. It's that the warning was never clear enough to convince them they had no other option. And that's one of the biggest lessons from Lassen. A vague warning rarely changes people's behavior. When the message is uncertain, most people hold on to what they know. They stay with their homes, their jobs, their routines, until the danger is no longer a possibility. It's already there. The most incredible part of this story happened in complete darkness. Around 11 p.m. on the 19th of May, 1915, Part of the lava dome at the top of Lassen Peak suddenly collapsed. No one saw it happen. There were no cameras, no scientists standing nearby. The closest homes were miles away, and thick clouds covered the mountain that night. Whatever happened at the summit happened completely out of sight. But even without witnesses, the mountain left behind enough evidence to tell the story. When the superheated lava crashed into deep snow, everything changed. The snow instantly turned into steam. Mud, rocks, broken trees, and volcanic debris rushed downhill through Lost Creek. The lahar kept moving for nearly 15 miles. In some places, it piled up almost 70 feet deep. The mountain had unleashed one of the most violent events of the entire eruption, and almost nobody even knew it had happened. About 2 hours later, around 1 o'clock in the morning, something unusual happened near Hat Creek. A rancher's dog suddenly started barking. The dog wouldn't stop. It woke its owner and pulled him outside. The creek was rising fast. The water wasn't just higher than normal, it was warm. It smelled like sulfur. Something was clearly wrong. The rancher didn't wait around to figure it out. He gathered his family and moved them to higher ground. By sunrise, the landscape had completely changed. A massive river of mud, rock, and shattered trees had swept through the valley. Without that dog's warning, the family could have woken up surrounded by a disaster they never saw coming. That's what makes this part of the story so haunting. No one watched the collapse. No one stood there and described it. The mountain told its story another way. Through the destroyed valley, through the fresh deposits of mud and rock, through streams that suddenly turned warm, through the smell of sulfur hanging in the air. Sometimes nature doesn't send obvious warnings. Sometimes the clues are small. The water feels different. The air smells strange. Animals start acting in ways they normally don't. Looking back, those details connected the entire story. And they remind us of something that's still true today. When nature suddenly changes its normal behavior, don't ignore it. Water, temperature, unusual smells, or even the behavior of animals can become the first signs that something dangerous is already happening. The morning after the lahar, Benjamin Loomis couldn't stay away. On May 21, he loaded his camera and headed back toward Lost Creek. He wanted to see what the mountain had left behind. When he got there, the destruction was still fresh. The ground was covered with mud and ash. In some places, steam was still rising from the debris. It didn't look like something that had happened yesterday. It looked like it was still happening. Loomis carefully photographed everything he could. He captured the smoking ash scattered across the valley. He photographed the giant boulder that had been blasted out of the crater just 2 days earlier. People called it the hot rock. Even after sitting out in the open for days, it was still too hot to touch. That alone told him how much heat the mountain was still holding inside. As he looked across the damaged landscape, Loomis couldn't shake one feeling. This wasn't over. Something told him the mountain still had more to say. So instead of staying home, he made another decision that most people probably wouldn't have made. He went back again the next morning. On May 22, he returned with his camera and spent hours documenting the volcano. He made 6 glass plate photographs. At the time, he had no idea those images would become some of the most important photographs in the history of American volcanology. Looking back, something almost unbelievable stands out. For nearly an entire year, Lassen kept erupting. Steam explosions, a growing crater, a collapsing lava dome, a powerful lahar. Again and again, the mountain struck places that just happened to be empty. Not because officials had cleared the area, not because there was a coordinated evacuation. People simply weren't standing where the danger happened to pass. Sometimes they had left a little earlier. Sometimes they were working somewhere else. Sometimes it was nothing more than timing. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Loomis finally packed up his camera. He folded his tripod, loaded everything onto his wagon, and headed home. He thought his work for the day was finished. An hour later, the mountain proved him wrong. The place where he had been standing disappeared beneath a deadly pyroclastic flow. If Loomis had stayed just 1 more hour, those famous photographs might have been buried with the man who took them. That's the part that stays with me. Curiosity can lead people to incredible discoveries. The desire to document history can preserve moments the world would otherwise forget. But sometimes, those same instincts bring you closer to danger than you ever realize. And that's exactly what happened to Benjamin Loomis. Around 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 22nd of May 1915, everything changed. For almost a year, Lassen had been building toward this moment. Deep inside the mountain, pressure had been growing beneath the lava dome. Little by little, trapped gas kept pushing harder against the rock above it. Then, the mountain reached its limit. The summit exploded. The top of Lassen was blown apart in an instant. A massive column of ash, volcanic gas, and shattered rock shot straight into the sky. Within just a few minutes, it climbed more than 30,000 feet, high enough to be seen from hundreds of miles away. But the most dangerous part wasn't what went up, it was what came back down. The lower part of the eruption cloud became too heavy to stay in the air. It collapsed. A wall of superheated ash, gas, and broken rock rushed down the northeast side of the mountain. This wasn't an ordinary landslide, it was a pyroclastic flow. The temperature was hot enough to kill almost instantly. The speed was far beyond anything a person could outrun. If you were standing in its path, there was almost no chance to react. Within minutes, the flow tore across the landscape. Old-growth pine trees that had stood there for generations snapped like matchsticks. The ground disappeared beneath layers of scorching ash. Everything living in its path was either buried, burned, or swept away. By the time it finally stopped, nearly 7 square miles of forest had been devastated. Even today, more than a century later, people can still see the scar it left behind. Whenever I think about this part of the story, one question keeps coming back. If a pyroclastic flow can reach you in seconds, what good is a warning that comes after the eruption has already started? The truth is, there isn't one. When it comes to something this fast, there is no last-second escape. There is no running for your life. The only real chance of surviving is to be gone before the mountain releases that energy. That's one of the hardest lessons Lassen teaches us. Some natural disasters give you time to react. A pyroclastic flow doesn't. Once it's moving, the decision that matters has already been made. Either you left the danger zone early, or you're still standing there when the mountain arrives. The eruption wasn't over. Not even close. As the pyroclastic flow raced down the northeast side of Lassen, it slammed into deep snow covering the mountain. The heat was unbelievable. The snow didn't slowly melt. It flashed into steam almost instantly. That sudden burst of steam changed everything. The hot ash, loose rock, and volcanic debris mixed with water and turned into another massive lahar. A second mudflow was born. This one was even larger and more powerful than the one that had come down just a few days earlier. It followed the same path through Lost Creek. Then it kept going. The flood spread into Lower Hat Creek, carrying mud, broken trees, and huge rocks with it. Homes were flooded. A sawmill was destroyed. Bridges were damaged or swept away. The mountain wasn't just exploding anymore. It was reshaping the entire valley. At that same moment, Benjamin Loomis was already about 8 miles away. He had packed up his equipment and was driving home through the forest. Then he heard it. A series of deep, booming sounds rolled across the landscape. Later, he said they reminded him of distant artillery. He stopped his wagon, turned around, and reached for his camera one more time. From where he stood, he photographed the towering eruption column rising above Lassen. Those photographs would later become some of the most important images ever taken of an American volcanic eruption. They appeared in books, scientific reports, and history lessons for generations. What still amazes me is this. Just 1 hour earlier, the man holding that camera had been standing almost exactly where the pyroclastic flow would tear through. If he had stayed a little longer, those photographs might never have existed. Sometimes history survives because one person leaves at exactly the right moment. And there's another lesson here that still matters today. People often think they're safe because they feel far enough away. But natural disasters don't care how safe a place feels. They only care about how far they can actually reach. Real safety isn't measured by your confidence. It's measured by the true reach of the danger. And in Lassen's case, That reach was much farther than anyone standing there could have imagined. Looking back, one thing still feels almost impossible. For all the power Lassen released, no one was standing in the path of the pyroclastic flow when it came down. The lahar tore through valleys. It flooded homes. It destroyed a sawmill. It damaged bridges. But somehow, no one was killed by it. That's why many geologists later gave this eruption a surprising nickname. They called it the eruption that missed. Not because it wasn't dangerous. It absolutely was. It missed because, again and again, small decisions and pure chance kept people out of its way. Benjamin Loomis packed up and left about an hour before the main eruption. Ranchers had moved some of their cattle away from the valley. A teacher canceled a planned hiking trip. A road crew had already closed one of the routes through the area. And one family's life may have been saved because a dog refused to stop barking in the middle of the night. None of those decisions were connected. No one was following an emergency plan. No one was responding to an official evacuation order. They were simply ordinary choices that happened to line up at exactly the right time. The mountain helped, too. The main blast was directed toward a sparsely populated area northeast of the summit. Very few people lived there in 1915. If the eruption had been aimed toward the small community of Viola instead, this story could have ended very differently. That's the part people sometimes forget. When they hear there were no deaths, it's easy to assume everything worked the way it should have. It didn't. There was no warning system protecting people, no emergency plan, no coordinated evacuation. No one truly had control of the situation. People survived because the mountain happened to miss them. That's luck. And luck is a dangerous thing to misunderstand. If we start believing a disaster was handled well simply because no one died, we risk learning the wrong lesson. The next eruption might not be so forgiving. That's why Lassen still matters today. Good outcomes don't always mean good preparation. Sometimes they simply mean everything broke your way. And that's never something you can count on. Luck is a gift. It's never a plan. Just 1 year after the eruption, in 1916, the area became Lassen Volcanic National Park. Over time, nature started healing itself. Trees slowly returned. The scars left by the eruption became harder to see. Today, if you visit the park, it's peaceful. The trails are quiet. The forests are green. Most people would never guess that this place was once torn apart by one of the most violent volcanic events in American history. The famous Hot Rock is still there. It sits almost exactly where Benjamin Loomis photographed it more than a century ago. It's one of the few reminders that what happened here wasn't a story or a legend. It was real, and it happened within living history. But here's the important part. Geologists have never considered Lassen an extinct volcano. As far as science is concerned, it's still active. Today, the mountain is watched around the clock. Scientists track earthquakes beneath the volcano. They measure tiny changes in the shape of the ground. They monitor volcanic gases escaping from deep underground. Those instruments can detect changes long before most people would notice anything unusual. That doesn't mean another eruption is about to happen. Right now, there is no evidence that Lassen is getting ready for one. But there's also no evidence that its volcanic story is over. The 1915 eruption wasn't the only one in this region's history. Over thousands of years, Lassen has built lava domes, produced explosive eruptions, and constantly reshaped the landscape around it. That's simply what active volcanoes do. Sometimes they stay quiet for decades, sometimes for centuries. Silence doesn't mean they're finished. It only means they're quiet today. And I think that's the biggest lesson this mountain leaves us with. We often mistake calm for safety. We see green forests, hiking trails, and peaceful views, and we assume the danger is gone. Nature doesn't work that way. A quiet volcano isn't promising it will never erupt again. It's only telling us one thing. It hasn't erupted today. Everything after that is a question the future will answer. When you look back at everything that happened in 1915, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Lassen gave people warning after warning. Not one, not 10. Nearly 180 separate signs that the mountain was changing. But most of those warnings never turned into organized action. There was no public warning system, no emergency agency coordinating a response, no valley-wide evacuation. Scientists were doing their job. They were watching the volcano, collecting data, and sharing what they found. But there was no clear path from science to the people whose lives were at risk. And somehow, when the biggest eruption finally came, no one died. It's tempting to call that a success, but it wasn't. It wasn't great planning. It wasn't a perfect emergency response. It was a series of lucky breaks that happened to line up. The area was sparsely populated. The pyroclastic flow moved toward a place where very few people lived. Roads happened to be empty. Benjamin Loomis left just in time. A handful of small, unrelated decisions came together in a way no one could have planned. It almost feels like a miracle. Today, we're in a very different place. We have satellites, sensitive earthquake sensors, GPS stations that can detect tiny movements in the ground. Scientists can measure changes that people in 1915 could never have seen. But even with all that technology, one thing hasn't changed. A machine can send a warning. It can't make people believe it. It can't make people leave. That choice still belongs to us. So here's the question I keep coming back to. If Lassen gave us 180 warnings again, would we actually listen? Or would we keep waiting until the mountain forced us to? Because in the end, a disaster doesn't need people to believe it's coming. It only needs them to still be standing in the wrong place when time finally runs out.